Divers reached the bottom of Lake Tahoe. What the cameras recorded changed everything. A steel cable unspools into water, so clear it looks fake, and for a few seconds the only sound in the control room is the hum of a winch. Then someone whispers we're passing 300 feet, and every person on that boat goes quiet because everyone on board grew up hearing the same story, that nothing sent into Lake Tahoe ever really comes back the same, and that some things sent down never come back up at all. For as long as people have lived along its shoreline, Lake Tahoe has carried a reputation that has nothing to do with skiing or sunsets. It's the reputation of a lake that keeps secrets. Locals will tell you, half joking and half not, that the lake has no floor, that it connects to some hidden channel beneath the mountains, that anything lost over the side of a boat simply falls forever. And alongside that story sits a darker one, repeated in bars and campgrounds for generations, that the cold near the bottom is so total, so still, that anything which sinks into it stays exactly as it was the day it went under.
Boots, boats, people,
all supposedly waiting down there, untouched by time, in water too dark and too dangerous for anyone to ever go check. For most of the lake's history, nobody could prove that idea wrong because nobody could survive long enough to try. But that changed the day engineers lowered a remotely operated vehicle over the side of a survey boat and pointed its cameras straight down into the deepest, coldest, most talked about basin in the Sierra Nevada. What came back up wasn't a ghost story. It was something stranger, and in its own way, far more revealing. Before we get to what the cameras found, it helps to understand exactly what kind of place Lake Tahoe actually is, because the scale of it is the reason the myths ever took hold in the first place. Lake Tahoe sits high in the mountains along the California-Nevada border, filling a basin that was shaped by shifting fault lines and scoured wider by glaciers thousands of years ago. From a beach chair, it looks like any other alpine lake, blue, calm, ringed by pine trees and granite boulders. But that calm surface is misleading. At its deepest surveyed point, the lake floor sits somewhere around 1,600 feet below the surface, making it one of the deepest bodies of water on the entire continent. Numbers like that are hard to picture, so try it this way. Take one of the tallest buildings in any major city, something pushing past 1,000 feet of steel and concrete, and imagine tipping it over into the lake. In most spots, the tip of that building would still be underwater. The lake holds an almost unbelievable volume, something on the order of tens of trillions of gallons, enough, according to hydrologists, to cover an area the size of a small state under more than a foot of water if it were ever drained out flat. This isn't a pond with a scary reputation. It's a genuine deep-water basin, with its own internal weather, its own crushing pressure, and its own permanent darkness far below where any swimmer would ever go. And that darkness is exactly where the legends live. As the survey vehicle descended that morning, the operators watched the readouts on their monitors shift in real time. Near the surface, the water sat at a comfortable, swimmable temperature. But as the vehicle sank past a few hundred feet, that number stopped falling gradually and instead locked into place, hovering just above freezing. This is a real and well-documented feature of very deep lakes. Below a certain depth, seasonal warmth from the sun never reaches the water at all. It stays at essentially the same near-freezing temperature in July as it does in January, sealed off from sunlight, motion, and oxygen. It's not spooky. It's physics. But it is also the exact condition that makes decomposition slow to a crawl, which is precisely the detail that generations of storytellers seized on to build their legend of a lake that preserves the dead like a walk-in freezer. That's the raw material the myth was built from. Real depth, real cold, real preservation chemistry, stitched together with rumor into a story about rows of bodies standing upright on the lake floor, supposedly left behind from darker decades in the region's past. And at the center of that legend sits one famous, endlessly repeated quote, attributed to one of the most celebrated ocean explorers of the 20th century. As the story goes, he once piloted a submersible into Tahoe's deepest water, resurfaced pale and unwilling to elaborate, and when finally pressed for details, said only that people were better off not knowing what he'd seen down there. It's a fantastic line. It's also, as far as any researcher, journalist, or family member close to that explorer has ever been able to confirm, completely unsourced. There's no interview, no transcript, no dated recording of him ever saying those words, and there's no verified record that he ever piloted anything into Tahoe's deepest basin at all. People connected to his own expeditions have pushed back on the claim for years. The quote survives anyway, the way great campfire lines always do, not because it's documented, but because it's quotable. And once you realize the most famous piece of evidence behind Tahoe's darkest legend can't actually be traced to anyone, it changes how you look at everything else stacked on top of it. Still, disproving a rumor with logic only gets you so far. What actually settled the question wasn't an argument. It was a camera. Sending a diver down to check has never really been an option. Recreational scuba divers are trained to treat anything much past 130 feet as dangerous, since nitrogen begins to impair judgment the deeper you go, long before you'd get anywhere near Tahoe's true floor. Add in water that sits barely above freezing for hundreds of feet, plus the fact that the whole lake already sits more than 6,000 feet above sea level, which changes the physics of pressure and gas absorption in ways that make standard dive calculations riskier, and you get a basin that is, almost by design, off-limits to the human body. So instead, researchers turned to machines. Sonar units fired pulses of sound downward and timed their return, slowly building a picture of the lake floor one echo at a time. Tethered robotic vehicles, carrying floodlights and high-resolution cameras, were lowered on cable to go where no diver reasonably could, streaming everything back to monitors on a boat where people could watch in real time, warm, dry, and safe. This wasn't a treasure hunt. The people running these surveys were scientists mapping sediment, slope, and water chemistry, trying to understand the basin as a living system. But once those sonar pulses started bouncing back clean, measurable signals from an actual solid floor, they had already, almost as a side effect, begun quietly dismantling 100 years of folklore. The descent itself is worth picturing because it's genuinely striking footage. In the first several dozen feet, the water is so clear that the lakebed looks almost artificial, sunlight cutting down in sharp beams, individual pebbles visible on the sandy bottom. It's the kind of clarity Tahoe is famous for, and for a short while it holds. But clarity and depth are two different things, and they don't stay friends for long. As the vehicle continues down, color starts leaving the image, the way it always does underwater. Reds and oranges fade first, then yellows, until the world on screen is reduced to shades of blue and green. Past a few hundred feet, even that thins out, and the picture on the monitor becomes a small cone of white light pushed out by the vehicle's own floodlamps, surrounded on every side by water so dark it swallows the beam within a few feet. It's somewhere in this transitional gloom, before full darkness sets in, that the survey recorded one of its strangest and most legitimate discoveries. Not corpses, not monsters, but trees. Upright, rooted trunks standing on the lake floor roughly a couple hundred feet below the surface, spaced the way a living forest naturally spaces itself, some stripped bare by time, others still holding bare skeletal branches reaching up into the water above them. When researchers were eventually able to date with samples pulled from similar submerged stands elsewhere in the basin, the results came back astonishingly old, consistent with trees that had been standing in that spot for thousands of years, long before recorded history in the region began. Trees don't grow underwater, which means something else has to be true. The surface of Tahoe was once dramatically lower than it is today, low enough that this section of ground was open, dry forest catching mountain sunlight. At some point, the water level rose and rose enormously, gradually enough that it didn't rip these trees out by the roots or leave them shattered and scattered across the bottom the way a flash flood or sudden surge would. Instead, the forest simply stopped growing and stayed standing exactly where it had always been, slowly sealed under rising water. Scientists can measure that this happened. They're still working out precisely how and how fast, and that unresolved question is arguably a far more interesting mystery than anything the old campfire stories ever offered, because it's real, it's ongoing, and it's backed by datable physical evidence instead of a rumor with no source. The survey continued past the drowned forest, deeper into total darkness, the depth counter climbing steadily past 400 feet, then 5, then 600. It's around this stretch that sonar operators noticed something new in the data, a tight cluster of hard, irregular returns sitting where the surrounding floor was otherwise smooth, undisturbed sediment. On a sonar screen, a cluster like that doesn't tell you what it is. It could be a rock slide. It could be geological debris settled over thousands of years. Or, if you'd grown up on the same stories everyone in that control room had grown up on, it could be something else. The exact kind of shape a body or several bodies might make resting together on a lake floor. Nobody said that out loud. They just steered the vehicle over, angled the floodlights down, and waited for the picture to resolve. What came into view was almost anticlimactic, in the best possible way. Not bodies. Not a submerged crime scene. Bottles.
Cans.
A tangled mass of old fishing line and gear, rusted and fused together by decades under pressure and cold. Part of a tire. Scraps of metal too corroded to identify. 600 feet beneath one of the clearest, most celebrated lakes on the continent, the cameras pointed directly at the spot the legends had always promised held the darkest secret, and instead found trash, ordinary, everyday litter that had been sinking into that basin, mostly unnoticed for decades. That moment is really the turning point of the whole survey, and it's worth sitting with because there was no dramatic reveal, no sealed-off site, no urgent phone call to authorities. Just a sonar map filling in, line by patient line, and hours of footage that quietly answered a question people had been afraid to ask directly for 100 years. Lake Tahoe is not bottomless. Its floor sits at a measurable depth that's now been mapped in more detail than most stretches of dry land nearby. And that floor does not hold rows of preserved bodies standing in silent formation, waiting to be discovered. The cold, oxygen-starved conditions that made the legend sound plausible are absolutely real. They do slow decomposition dramatically, but the leap from this water preserves things to this water is hiding an army of the dead, was never actually built on evidence. It was built on one unsourced quote, and generations of people repeating it because it made for a great story. What the survey did confirm, though, is arguably more unsettling in a quieter way. Scattered across the mapped floor, not just in one grim cluster, but spread through the shallows, out into the deep blue water, and down into the permanent black, the cameras recorded an accumulating scatter of ordinary human litter. Glass, aluminum, plastic, fishing debris, sunk and preserved by exactly the same cold, still conditions that folklore had reserved for corpses. Decades of it, sitting largely undisturbed on the bed of a lake that people drive for hours specifically to see because they consider it one of the most pristine places in the country. That's the actual discovery. Not a monster. Not a vault of the dead. A mirror. It's easy to feel a comfortable shiver over a ghost story about standing corpses because it asks nothing of you. It's happening to someone else, somewhere unreachable a long time ago. It's a different feeling entirely to look at footage of bottles and cans resting on the floor of a lake you might have swum in yourself last summer and realize every single piece of that debris got there because someone standing on a boat or a dock on some ordinary afternoon let it go. That finding didn't just sit in a research file somewhere. It became the starting point for cleanup efforts that followed, using the new maps to send divers and equipment back down, this time specifically to recover what had been left behind, hauling up debris piece by piece from a floor that, for the first time in the lake's long history, people could actually see clearly instead of only imagining. So here's where the story actually lands, and it's a little less dramatic than the campfire version, but arguably more worth telling. The lake is not bottomless. It has a real, measured floor roughly 1,600 feet down. It is not a hidden graveyard of standing bodies. The cameras looked exactly where the legend said to look, and found ordinary refuse instead. The famous quote about a world not ready for what's down there has no confirmed source, and may never have actually been spoken by the man it's credited to. And the drowned forest is completely real, genuinely strange, and still standing in the dark after thousands of years, holding on to a mystery about the lake's history that scientists are still working to fully explain. The bottom of Lake Tahoe turned out to hold no bodies and no monster. It held trees that grew long before anyone was around to write the myths down, a rise in the water level nobody has fully explained yet, and a scattered, sobering amount of trash that we put there ourselves. The cameras went looking for a legend and came back with something more useful, a clear, honest picture of a place people love, and a reminder of exactly what that love is going to require going forward. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Did you grow up hearing that Tahoe had no bottom, or that something was hiding down there in the cold and the dark? And now that the floor has actually been mapped, and the mystery turned out to be litter instead of legend, what do you think should happen next for a lake this many people claim to treasure? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you want to keep following stories about the places most people never get to see for themselves, stick around, because there's always something deeper worth looking into.